We recently had a video discussing how the Nicaraguan Cordoba is able to maintain such a strong degree of stability against the US dollar. And it does. It is truly amazing. But someone hopped in and pointed out that over the last decade or so that the Cordoba has lost about 38% against the dollar. Now, that could mean a lot of different things, so we're going to talk about what that means exactly and why that does not actually influence stability and what you need to know so that, for example, if this is something you're concerned about, which you should not be, but what if you are, how do you look at it differently and protect yourself against what is a perceived volatility and not actually a danger with the Cordoba. So we're going to talk about the constant decline of the Cordoba right after the bump. All right, let's start right off with an important definition. Currency is a media that you use for a transaction between two different entities. It is something that you purchase things with. It is something you are paid with. The purpose, the value, the thing that makes a currency exist is that it is assigned a temporary value during which time you're doing a transaction. That's what makes it a currency. It is a really common thing today, and mostly just recently, to associate currencies with things that they are not supposed to be associated with, primarily with being wealth stores. Now, we can see that this has come strongly from the ideas of cryptocurrency, where suddenly there's a lot of new currencies on the market, a lot of things have changed, and people are very confused by the concept of just money. Growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, people generally knew what money was, but I find that today, having a simple conversation about just what money is really difficult because people now imagine money not to be a means of transacting commerce, but instead they believe it's meant to be a way to hold wealth, which few things could be farther from the truth. That is not its purpose, it's not the intention, and it is not a good idea. So, when we're looking at money, people will often talk about how the US dollar has lost 99% of its value. You say, what are you talking about? It's functioned the same my entire life. And yes, there has been inflation, but it's nothing dramatic like that. And what they mean is going back to when the first word dollar was ever released, they had one value, and now hundreds of years later, well, maybe not hundreds, but more than 100 years later, by far, it has a much lower value. And this is because they're looking at money over a nonsensical period of time. There is some value to looking at money over long periods of time to understand large global trends, to compare things historically, to see how money typically moves when other factors are applied and so forth, so we can learn some things from historical monetary values. But what we can't do is see an actual change in volatility of money, because money only has a purpose in the moment. It is meant to do a transaction. It is not supposed to be something you hold on to. Of course, everyone needs a little bit of money because you might have to pick up a hamburger on the way home. Yes, you have to have a tiny amount of wealth stored in your money. But the poor do not store wealth, right? If you are truly living, as we say, paycheck to paycheck, you do not have any value tied up in currency. So if there was to be a change in value of currency over time, you won't notice it because naturally cost of products will go up, but your salary will as well. If it does not happen, then it is not the currency that is changing in value, but rather the cost of the goods you are buying. If you are rich, then you know very well not to hold your money in currency. Anyone with any amount of financial training knows you hold money in, or your wealth in, places that are able to withstand inflation, whether that is businesses or in commodities or in any number of things. Real estate, for example. You find ways to make your money work for you and to hedge against inflation. You do not hold your money as a currency because that is a way to simply set it on fire. And importantly, the United States dollar, as with basically all currencies, slowly becomes worth less value over time. This is the natural progression of money. There are exceptions. There are temporary and special cases where you're going to see money actually gain value or hold steady, but this is super rare. And it's difficult to actually define what holding steady is because you have to hold steady against something. There is no such thing, contrary to what hucksters will tell you. There isn't any solid means of comparing the value of money. One of the best comparisons, one of the few things that changes very little, is using the effort and time needed to work a full day. So a human should be compensated a certain value. And this is why there are currencies, or has been historically, ones that use a labor hour as the measurement for a single bill. But even that, humans change in efficiency over time, and one human does a different job than another, and they do not all earn the same amount of money. Finding an average across an entire society, it gets difficult at the best of times. So that is the closest thing we have to a measure. Some people want to assign it to like really crazy things like a metal, something you can mine, find more of, manipulate in the market. Makes no sense. So there is no solid thing. All different currencies and things that they are measured against move all the time. It is a constant sea of change. This can lead to lots of misleading things. So for example, most of us understand that the US dollar is worth less today than it was, say, 2 decades ago. But we still look at Bitcoin, just as an example, and say that it has gained value over time, but we compare that to the US dollar that has lost value over that same time, and we forget to evaluate the Bitcoin for having lost that same value from the underlying dollar. So if a Bitcoin is worth exactly $1, that is not at all what it's worth. It's worth nearly $100,000 to a single Bitcoin, but let's just imagine that a Bitcoin is worth $1 today, and it was also worth $1 10 years ago. Well, that dollar, we would all say, has lost value during that time. Maybe 10 or 15% has eroded. But if you ask someone about Bitcoin, they would likely say it's held its value, which is not in any way whatsoever correct. That is a scam. It has actually lost the same 15% as the dollar that it is being measured against. If it had held steady and the dollar had lost 15%, then the Bitcoin would be worth about $1.15, more or less. So that is an important thing to understand with measurements. So we don't look historically at the value for volatility, however. What we worry about is transactions day to day. The reason for this is that all currencies slide over time. It's just the nature of things. So if we are attempting to misuse a currency as a wealth store, then yes, we're going to see what we perceive as volatility over time because it will lose value. But that's not really volatility. That is easily predicted and expected. If someone keeps money in a currency, they were planning on that money eroding. I don't know why anyone would ever do that unless they truly believe that everything else is going to collapse, and the one thing that's going to get stronger is currency to reflect that. And that doesn't really happen. But if it did, well, they would have paid off, but it's a huge gamble against the entire market. It is quite something to do. Now, if you're an expert in finance and you're doing that on a day-to-day basis, yes, you can do that. But over time, as a wealth store, no. So currencies are not wealth stores. Therefore, volatility must be measured in small periods of time, the time that it takes to actually acquire and transact money. So what kind of time period are we talking about? Generally, we mean weeks to months at most. Definitely not years. Normal humans are paid at the longest on monthly cycles, but there are exceptions. There are people who are paid by the year, but generally those are people who are very rich and not paid directly in a currency. They're normally paid in stock options and so forth, which are floating in a completely different world, and so it is extremely rare, and it is essentially unheard of that it matters for this discussion to look in periods of years. Basically, we're looking at weeks and months. If you have a volatility that happens day to day, you've got a currency that is basically unusable. If you are fluctuating weeks or months, you have a dangerous currency where people are needing to watch it carefully. This is what happens during cases of hyperinflation. So for example, Brazil, when I was a kid in the early 1980s, or Argentina just in the last couple of years, had experienced hyperinflation to the point where when you got paid one day, you were actually worried about the price of bread and milk and eggs changing before you could get to the market. Your salary would literally have to vary day to day to reflect the change in the currency. That's quite insane. It means people are changing their sleep schedules to accommodate the volatility of the currency. That's a major problem and an extreme example. But if you have to do anything that involves purchasing early or late based on your paycheck cycle, that's volatility. If things that you plan to purchase are affordable or not affordable during the time frame that you are normally shopping, that's volatility. But if you're talking about your savings over time that you would put into the savings account and hold on to for a while and eventually take out for something, that is not a time period of measuring volatility. If you're getting to that kind of time frame, you should be holding your money in a wealth store, something like an investment account or in real estate or in commodities or so forth. What is right for you will vary by every person. It is a complex situation and something different to talk about. But this is just to understand what volatility is in the terms of currency. Anything that is happening over a period of years is irrelevant because no one should be holding currency for that long. Now, what makes the Cordoba so special in how it's non-volatile against the US dollar? What protects the people of Nicaragua from having Cordoba and having that rate change, as we know it does, over time and losing at least some amount of value? We know they won't lose everything and the rate is not terrible, but if you were to just hold, say, 100,000 Cordoba today, over time we can predict that it'll be worth less in dollars than it is today. Why? Nicaragua has always used a creeping peg versus the US dollar, at least since the 1990s. This system means that over time, the Cordoba and the dollar are locked together. So if the United States dollar experiences inflation, the Cordoba matches it in that inflation. However, about once a year, the Cordoba would be adjusted on a planned date, on a planned schedule that was published way ahead of time for a planned change in value against the US dollar so that it would be worth a little less, meaning that $1 would get you a few more Cordobas. Currently, you get about 36.4 Cordobas for every US dollar. The previous move was something in the 35s, the one before that, low 35s, one before that, 34 something, and so forth. So we have a small change. If you were holding normal amounts of transactions, such as a monthly paycheck and you're off to buy your groceries, the change is so small that even if you had that money in your pocket and the change went through and all of the items in the market varied their prices to accommodate for that, which is not necessarily how things happen, you would barely notice. Maybe you get one less egg in the month. The change that we are talking about is very, very small. So for normal people who are living paycheck to paycheck, it all happens in one day, and only the money that you're holding in your pocket or in a bank account on that day, which for most Nicaraguans is extremely little, could be affected. And the amount that it's affected, while potentially noticeable, would be barely noticeable. And it would be all absorbed in a single day, right? If you're being paid by the week, it would just be the amount that you had from that week would be affected. These are tiny numbers. If you had any amount of Cordoba, something that was enough that it may affect you to the point where maybe you couldn't buy that sandwich you wanted or something because of the transaction, you have an option. You can simply go the day before this is going to happen, take all of the cash, all of the currency that you have access to. This could be in your bank account, in your pockets, stuffed into your mattresses, does not matter. Take all of that and convert it into US dollars. Remember, the rate of exchange between the Cordoba and the US dollar is guaranteed here in Nicaragua, so you can go to the bank and get the official government transfer rate the day before this creeping peg takes place. Now, it is important to note right now the creeping peg is suspended due to high inflation in the U.S., so Nicaragua is absorbing that higher inflation by eliminating their own localized inflation until such time as it makes sense to go back. So at the moment, there is no creeping peg, and there hasn't been for a few years. We will be returning to it, I am sure, in the near future. But for the moment, as long as the U.S. is still in a high volatility state, we are absorbing that volatility using the Cordoba, which is interesting because it actually means that even though the Cordoba is locked to the dollar, the Cordoba is technically the more stable of the two currencies because it has a stabilization mechanism against the dollar. It's actually super interesting. Okay, so I digress. You've changed all your money into U.S. dollars. You then have nothing to do but ride the volatility of the U.S. dollar, which you would have done with Cordoba anyway. You wait until the next day when the rate has changed and convert your money back to Cordoba once again. It is that simple, and now you have the same value that you had the day before in dollars, but back in Cordoba again. You will actually have gained Cordoba simply by holding dollars during that midnight changeover, or I don't know exactly what time of day they make the monetary change, but all the banks change at once. All the credit card systems change at once, so it is one rate, one moment, one rate the next moment, and anyone who is concerned has a mechanism to lock their money into the US dollar and ride through the change. This only happens once a year at most, sometimes once every few years, so it's not a major thing, and the change is small. And that's kind of what they intend people to do so that, yeah, there's a small change of the value that's out on the market, but in general, no one's really impacted. And we really don't sit around thinking about it. As people who are here deal with the money all the time, we don't worry about this change. It's mostly ignored because it's so trivial, and the way that people know to handle money makes it easy. Anything like real estate simply goes up in value in Cordoba and stays the same value in dollars as these things change. You're often seeing the cost of goods going down just slightly. This type of inflation is actually a little bit nice because you often see products in the market maintain prices, I think, a little bit more stably because of this. Some places will raise the price based on this very obviously, but not all places do. So we sometimes see actually a lessening of the impact of inflation because of this system, whereas in places like the United States, because their inflation is organic rather than forced, it is being driven by the raise in price of products rather than the currency changing with forced inflation and the value of all stated products going down. Nicaragua also has a very large percentage of its population on or near minimum wage. And because of this, forced minimum wage rates across different industries actually has much more of an effect than you would see in, say, the United States, where almost no one is at minimum wage. Changing minimum wage rates in the United States, while you can argue that it has value, doesn't have a large impact. It drives a lot of conversations, and certain businesses are affected much more than others, and I don't want to get into a debate as to whether or not it is a good thing. But the bottom line is, in the United States, the percentage of the population impacted by a change of minimum wage is quite small. Here in Nicaragua, because unemployment is the national crisis, and that means many people work at minimum wage, which is the nature of any place with very high unemployment, the government changing minimum wages actually impacts a very noticeable percentage of the population. So when they do an enforced inflation change, they generally tie with it at essentially the same time a change in minimum wage rates to reflect that inflation change. That means that unlike the United States, where goods get more expensive, people still make less, and eventually their salaries catch up. Instead, we have all the products get just slightly cheaper, and people make more money, and then the prices of goods rise over time to match what is surplus money on the market. It is the opposite effect, and I'm not saying that everyone should go out and do this and that it's a magic panacea to the way that monetary systems work, but it is super interesting, and in places like Nicaragua, it actually can work, whereas the exact same system being used in the United States would be an utter disaster. You have to have the right tool for the right market. So what's interesting at the end of the day, if you look at day-to-day volatility of the Cordoba versus the US dollar, the volatility is essentially zero. It's not actually zero, but it's really close to zero. It is zero in the way that it affects any normal person. If we look at it over a period of time, if we only look at a chart, we will say things like, well, it isn't very volatile, which is the definition of the spikes and troughs that you see on the graph. There's extremely little of that, but there is a constant slide. One can argue that the slide itself does not represent any form of volatility whatsoever. It is completely stable, even though the rate is not flat, and that is a reasonable argument. I would say that that is correct. However, you could look at it as one big change, and that change, while not super volatile, does exist, and that's a reasonable argument. But if we were to look at that purely from the chart perspective and look at the value of Cordoba versus the dollar in a vacuum, we would get one picture, a picture of extreme non-volatility, but this change that would be worrisome to someone who may accidentally try to use Cordoba as a wealth store. However, it does not take into account that this is a creeping peg with predictable dates and guaranteed transaction the day before and day after. So a person with any reasonable effort who started with a certain number of Cordobas worth, let's say, $100 way back, we're going to say in like 1993, and I don't know what the original rate was. We'll just say it was 20 Cordobas to the dollar. So they would have had 2,000 Cordobas or $100 in 1993. Now, this is only tracking the dollar. We're not trying to beat inflation of the dollar, right? That's a different thing. You invest for that. You don't just hold currency. All of this is a moot point when it comes to real world finance. Do not hold currency. Okay, so someone who has 2,000 Cordoba or $100 equivalent of Cordoba in about 1993 and wants to hold on to that cash for some crazy reason and wants to hold it until today, you would hope would still have $100 US worth of money. But that couldn't be 2,000 Cordoba, because $100 today is about 3,640 Cordoba, or we just roughly say 3,700. But the point being, it would be a lot more, not that far off from double. I guess 38% more according to the calculations that someone did. It's a significant amount, however. So what would they have realistically done? Well, throughout that time, they would have known when those changes were going to happen. So at any time that money was going to be held and the currency rate was going to change, they simply would have moved it into US dollars for the day and moved it back to Cordoba when they were done. That is awfully silly, and you can see why. If your goal was to hold the same amount of US dollars at the end of all that time, you would simply have held US dollars. You can move between Cordoba and US dollars anytime you want. So there's two things here that make it strange. One is you don't hold Cordoba for this purpose because you can hold dollars and turn it back into Cordoba at the higher rate at any time. So if they did exchange their 2,000 into $100, 2,000 Cordobas into $100, 20 years ago, whatever that is, and then today wanted to take it back in Cordoba, they would exchange it now, and with a single transaction have protected against 100% of volatility by doing that. But the theory is, what if they wanted to hold Cordoba all that time and not hold US dollars for whatever reason? Well, then every time just before there's going to be the exchange adjustment of the rate, they would simply turn it into dollars for a few hours, wait for the adjustment, and set it back. And therefore, all but for several hours during the last 20 years, they would have held Cordoba and always had that Cordoba cash at the ready, and today would still have 3,640 Cordobas from that initial 2,000 Cordobas that they started with, or a resulting value in US dollars of exactly $100. The system keeps it stable. So that volatility is misleading to think of it based on that chart, because with a little bit of effort, you can decide to not have that volatility actually exist for you. It simply is a change in numerical value. It's a very strange system because it's predictable like that. But so this gives a really good insight into why volatility has to be measured in certain ways, because there are things that can involve a change that are not volatile. Not all changes are volatile. And so in this way, the Cordoba is amazingly stable against the US dollar, basically never changing for all intents and purposes. But even more so, as a general piece of volatility, the Cordoba is slightly less volatile than the US dollar. So the only time that the Cordoba goes through any slightly less predictable change is when it is absorbing volatility from the US dollar to make it even better here in Nicaragua. It's a powerful tool and works really well. It's one of the things we're really proud of here in the country. And remember, having that dual currency system means that you don't have to worry about the volatility of the Cordoba if you don't want to use it here, but there's no reason to avoid it. It's a useful currency and it's going to give you the most flexibility here in country. Thank you for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. It's just like Patreon. It comes directly to me and helps me pay for the cameras and trips and software and all the things that we need to use to make this show possible for you guys. We really appreciate all the support that you guys give us. We've also got a join button down there. Plus, get in the show notes, loads of information to help you, whether you need to contact me or get on our social media or whatever. Everything you possibly could need is in the show notes. And of course, get in the comments, say hello. We love it when you guys give some feedback and ask your own questions. We love having viewer questions to provide feedback to. And as always, share on social media, tell someone about the show, and I will see all of you tomorrow.